Circumvention over compliance, taxpayer funding of transgenic edible plant vaccines, deregulation of local food, national divorce, the impact of the 2024 election on you and I, and probably most importantly, what you and I can actually do in light of all of it. All of this and more is coming up in a 25-minute power-packed interview with Congressman Thomas Massie. And while some of these topics may sound as though they're straight out of a science fiction film, please keep in mind that this is real-time information from a member of U.S. Congress. Timestamps to specific topics are below. Give this video a thumbs up to help it move forward, comment with what state you're watching from, and enjoy the interview. We are here with Mr. Thomas Massie, U.S. Representative for Kentucky's 4th Congressional District, engineer, farmer, inventor, Appalachian American, and I don't know how my viewers are going to feel about this when you do have a pronoun.
Papaw.
We'll have to hear in the comments as to how they feel about that.
Well, you know, when you become a grandparent, you have to assume a pronoun. And there were 4 grandparents and 1 grandchild, and so we had to mediate who got to be what, and I got to be Papaw.
You got it. Okay. So let us know in the comments if this is an acceptable pronoun for you guys, but I'm excited to be talking. Let's start with the very basics. As a state representative, what influence do you have on behalf of the public?
Well, sometimes I'm worried that I don't have enough. And as a representative in U.S. Congress, my preference is to defer to the states. So every time I can give the states more power, that's what I choose. I spend about a third of my time traveling, a third of my time in D.C., and a third of my time in Kentucky.
All right, so in sort of line with that, we're all concerned. Everybody's watching who's going to be president next. But I'm afraid that a larger portion of the population, maybe sometimes myself included, tend to forget that the United States is not a dictatorship. The power structure is to be limited and dispersed. Is there an importance in being just as engaged when it comes to these smaller offices as it is when we're considering who's going to be president next? Or should we just sit on our hands and wait for a better president?
Oh, you know, before I got involved in politics, I read this essay called The Dog Catcher Strategy. And it said everybody gets focused on the Super Bowl of politics, which is the presidential race. And they're all forgetting there's 3,000 counties in the United States, and each of those counties have elected offices, all the way down to dog catcher. And you need to have people of your persuasion in all of those offices down to dog catcher. So the first political office I ran for was county executive. And I wasn't the dog catcher, but the dog catcher worked directly for me. Animal control officer is the politically correct term these days. But it is really important to focus on these other races. A lot of people lose their mind when their person doesn't win president because they think we have a dictatorship, but we don't. You should focus on who your congressman is going to be because that's the person who's going to vote on the laws. The president, as you pointed out, is not a dictator, he's not an emperor, so Congress makes the laws. Congress is going to determine how you can farm and what food you can eat.
All right, so true or false, in your opinion, political conversation is always downstream of culture?
True. So for instance, states, and not even the federal government yet, but states have legalized marijuana, and the federal government is not enforcing their marijuana laws. That's not because anybody really voted that way in Congress. It's because there's so many people who are non-compliant. The culture has moved on, and the politics have not. And the politics are still trying to catch up with the culture, for better or worse. You know, I attend these events called the Rogue Food Conference, and I don't publicize them widely because we're not teaching compliance, we're teaching non-compliance and how to go around the law instead of complying with the law. And I think that's necessary. Sometimes you can move politics by voting, but sometimes you can just move it by being who you are.
So I personally believe there is a place and a time for both, but it is my desire to be politically proactive, I guess you'd say, rather than reactive. You know, for example, I'd like to combat attempts at regulatory overreach before it's signed into law, rather than having to rally and protest at court hearings. What are the best ways that just that concerned citizen can stay proactive before we have to become reactive?
So before I got elected to office, I didn't know what the best way was to influence elected people. And I would write these long letters and send them. And what I've discovered now is that's not the best way to influence your representative. I think the best way to do it is a phone call. And I know it's old-fashioned to pick up the phone and actually talk on it to another person on the other end, but because it is old-fashioned, it's actually very effective. And as a congressman, when I'm sitting in my office and I hear the phones ringing in my office, I'm like, oh no, who did we tick off today? And I'll walk out of my office and ask the folks, like, what are they all calling about? And so you can influence congressmen through phone calls. I've been on the floor of the House of Representatives where people are like torn, they don't know which way to vote. And they say, you know, I got 100 phone calls on this issue. And that, I'm like, I checked the box. I was like, this person is influenced by phone calls. And I would also preface this by saying, don't call people you can't vote for. They may be polite, but they're not writing anything you say down. Everybody in the United States has 3 federal people they can call. They have 2 U.S. senators and 1 U.S. representative. Don't call somebody else's senator. They might be polite, but they ain't listening.
Because they'll always ask when you get on the phone, what is your zip code?
They ask your zip code. We have caller ID. We know your area code. So unless you're really smart and you have a burner phone and you're spoofing like your phone number, you're probably not going to be very effective trying to be a citizen's lobby to a congressperson that you can't vote for.
Let's go ahead and segue into the Prime Act. Just a preface, as a small farmer myself, I struggled. I jumped into farming just as COVID broke out, but struggled realizing the bottleneck was not a food shortage. The bottleneck was a systemic failure. It was the absence of access to processing facilities. So the Prime Act caught my attention because it seemed a very viable solution. So let's go ahead and you briefly outline the Prime Act, its inception, the premise, its purpose, your role in it, just all of it.
So the idea for the Prime Act actually came in 2015 when Congress voted to get rid of country of origin labeling for beef and pork. They took away country of origin labeling for beef and pork, and I said, okay, we've got to enable a local food movement, so we need the Prime Act. And the Prime Act says that the federal government won't stop a transaction between a farmer and a consumer using a local processor as long as they're all inside of one state. And constitutionally, the government shouldn't have any authority as long as you're not crossing state lines. So this is an exemption that allows farmers to go directly to consumers using local processors. Its popularity more than doubled during COVID when we saw farmers who had to euthanize their animals. Like literally they were putting pigs in wood chippers in Iowa because there was nowhere else to put them. And people might say, well, why didn't you just keep them for another year? Because pigs don't have long lifespans and there's no nursing homes for pigs. The meat becomes unmarketable when an animal gets so old. I had Republicans and Democrats coming to me saying, we got to do something about this because I've got farmers who have to euthanize their animals. I've got consumers who can't get brisket at the store. And that's because our food supply was brittle and it's like a funnel. It all focuses down to one of 4 companies that process 85% of the meat in the United States. One is owned by China, one is owned by Brazil, maybe not the best plan there, and the other 2 are multinational companies. They basically forced out a lot of the small mom and pop processors that allow you to buy meat locally.
Do those particular companies have a big lobbying power within the kinds of laws that we're trying to push through that might help the smaller people?
Yeah, there are lobbyists, but they're not called Tyson lobbyists. They're not called JBS or Smithfield lobbyists. They're actually called National Cattlemen's Beef Association. They're actually called Farm Bureau. They sound like they are people for the small farmer, and they're actually small farmers that belong to these organizations, but they take the dues with the small farmers. They actually collect most of their money from the big corporations, and then they come to DC and act like they're for the little guy. Meanwhile, they're trying to perpetuate the existing regime that keeps the little guy from competing with the big guy. So they're the foxes watching the hen house. And I don't have people with, Smithfield stickers on their shirt coming to lobby me or even on their business cards. They're from these ostensibly, pro-farm organizations.
How does an organization that collects funding from the people they're supposed to be helping and then turn around and they lobby for the opponents of those people. How does that work?
So an organization like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association or Farm Bureau, they will go back to their members and say, oh, Congressman Massie has introduced this legislation that's very risky. And what will happen is there'll be an outbreak of E. coli or something, and then our entire beef industry will go down, or our entire milk industry will go down, or the entire poultry industry, and people will stop buying your products. So you need to make sure that Congressman Massie's bill doesn't become law, because it will risk what you're doing. Now, what they're doing is selling into a pipeline through the corporations. And the reality is all of the E. coli outbreaks come from the corporations. There's actually been a FOIA request to the USDA to report all of the outbreaks they know of from small farms and local processors. And the FOIA brings back nothing, not because they're hiding information, but because there have been no outbreaks. What the big organizations do is they try to convince their members that I'm risking their livelihood. And some of the members buy it. By the way, and a lot of the members aren't interacting with the federal storefront of their organization. They're interacting with county groups, which are doing good things oftentimes. Like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association may have an exhibit at the fair and they're selling, steak sandwiches and promoting beef, and that seems like a good thing. But by the time you get to the state level, they're almost against the small farmer, and by the time you get to the federal level, they're totally against the small farmer.
It's a bit of a Trojan horse then, in a sense.
Yep.
So at that, are they being alternatively funded by larger corporations? Is that something that can be said?
Oh, here's the worst part of it, and I fought it this summer with an amendment on the spending bills. There's actually something called the Commodity Checkoff Program, where every farmer that sells one of 22 different commodities, beef's included, dairy's included, all the grains are included. When you sell something, you have to pay $1 to this organization. It's not a government organization. It's not a private organization. It's like this quasi, thing. And they collect millions and millions and millions of dollars off of farmers. And then they're supposed to spend that money on programs like, if you've ever seen a commercial that says, got milk, okay, or beef, it's what's for dinner. Like, that's what they tell you they're doing with the money. And they're legally prohibited from using that money to lobby us, yet they do lobby us. And we found that out this summer when I tried to end the checkoff program. The checkoff program, it's called a checkoff program because farmers used to be able to check a box when they sold their stuff if they wanted to basically donate part of the money to this promotional organization. It's still called the checkoff program, but there's no box to check anymore. There's no box to uncheck. They just take your money when you sell it, and then they use that money to lobby against you. So the corporations aren't even spending their own money to keep the little farmer down. They're taking money from the little farmer and using that to lobby Congress.
Wow, that's a bit overwhelming. Let's go ahead and give just a simple overview of the legislative process. Somebody sees a congressman like you and they're like, you got good ideas, I want to support them. But what does it take to get it from being your idea to actually something that is going to be a law or enacted?
So the PRIME Act was conceived on a hay wagon on Joel Salatin's farm in Virginia. And by the time it was done, I got back and I went to my staff and I was like, okay, we need to write a bill that does this. And they wrote a draft and I edited it. And then we sent it to the main congressional lawyers who put it in law form. Then I introduced the bill into the hopper. There's literally like this bin in the House of Representatives where you put your little bill, and then they give you an HR number, and then that becomes the number that you have to tell your congressman, hey, please support HR whatever. If you're lucky, they'll have a hearing on your bill, and then if you're even luckier, they'll do a markup on your bill where they debate and amend your bill in the committee. Some bills die in committee, they don't make it out. Some bills get passed out of committee, so they, after they come out of the Committee of Jurisdiction, they actually go to the Rules Committee. And then they go to the floor of the House after they pass the Rules Committee, and everybody gets to vote on the bill, all 435 members of Congress from all the states. Now, that's not enough. It's still got to go to the Senate. And if the Senate passes a bill that has one word different in it, now you got to take the two bills, get together, and iron out the differences and pass them again. And once you get the House and the Senate to pass the same bill, it goes to the president. Hopefully he signs it. If he doesn't, it comes back and you can try to override his veto.
So is it the same at a state level, just, the governor instead of the president?
It's very similar at the state level. Oftentimes in state legislatures, it's easier to get a bill through committee and easier to get it to the floor. In the House of Representatives, it's like pulling teeth.
What is there anything that we can do on a concerned citizen level to get those onto the floor and recognized?
Well, phone calls really help. So you made a video a few months ago that was really helpful to me because a lot of people make phone calls when they saw your video, and that helped me get the bill that I've been working on, the Prime Act, part of it written into the Farm Bill. Odds of a bill passing are extremely low. Like we're at like HR 6,000 and something right now. And we only pass into law maybe 10 bills a year. So it's almost like winning the lottery to get your bill passed.
Is there an alternate means to the same end? Could we put forth, and how should we push for the putting forth of maybe regulatory exemptions specifically tailored to that direct purchase from the farmer by the consumer? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are alternate ways to achieve similar goals. For instance, we know that Congress is going to pass a spending bill every year. You could say in the spending bill that you could offer an amendment that says none of the funds hereby appropriated can be used to keep small farmers from using local producers to sell meat within the state. That would be an amendment you could offer to the spending bill that's not on the Farm Bill that would provide relief to small farmers.
All right, so let's transition into the Farm Bill itself. From a spending perspective, if I heard the reports right, it is the second largest piece of legislation in the country. It renews every 5 years, and this year it is renewing at a $1.5 trillion budget, which is up from $867 billion in 2018. Could you kind of give us an idea of where all of this money goes?
So the Farm Bill is actually a misnomer. 80% of the Farm Bill is what has been historically called food stamps. Now it's called SNAP. So that's like 80% of it. 20% of the spending in the Farm Bill goes to what I call farm stamps, subsidies for farmers. These are typically something that small farmers aren't looking for. Small farmers just want to have the government out of their way so they can sell to their neighbors, whereas the big farmers are looking for these subsidies that are in the Farm Bill. And the reason they do it that way is they want to get Democrats to vote for it and Republicans to vote for it. And a lot of the food assistance programs go to Democrat districts, to cities, and a lot of the farm assistance programs go to Republican districts out in the rural areas. And that's how they grease the skids and get this thing passed every 5 years.
So the Farm Bill was initially something that came out of the Great Depression. Was it ever intended to go so long or make such a deviation in the allocation of funds?
Oof, I wasn't around here for the Great Depression, so thankfully, so I don't know what the original intent was and how far they've strayed, but I think it's safe to say the Farm Bill does a lot of stuff that was never intended to do. For instance, the USDA is building fire departments in rural communities. I don't think that was ever intended to be part of the USDA's mission. So yeah, I think they're way beyond their mission. And all I want with the Prime Act, I don't want any money to be spent. All I want is just a little bit of freedom that can allow people to buy the healthy food that's locally grown.
If in 2018, $867 billion was allocated to that 5-year period, how do they continue to get funding?
So there's the Farm Bill, and then there's the Ag Approps Bill. So the Farm Bill sort of authorizes the spending. It says it's legal to spend the money, whereas the Ag Approps Bill, Agriculture Appropriations Bill, says here's the check and here's who the money's going to go to. By the way, in the Ag Approps Bill, I tried to defund research for transgenic edible plant vaccines. I know that's a mouthful and it sounds kind of scary, but it is scary. We are actually funding with taxpayer dollars research on vaccines to be grown in lettuce and spinach so that when people eat their lettuce and spinach, they will get vaccinated with whatever vaccine that plant is producing. I think we should know what's in our food. I don't think we need to be playing God with our spinach. And if somebody wants to do that, there probably needs to be tighter rules on it because pollen can escape and pollute seeds from neighboring farms or pollute plants in neighboring farms who never intended to be growing vaccines in their food. So I tried to put some rules on that in the Ag Appropriations bill, and I was able to stop taxpayer dollar spending in that Ag Appropriations bill, but they threw that bill in the trash and did an omnibus instead and didn't include the limitation on transgenic edible plant vaccine research. So guess what? Now you got another year of transgenic edible plant vaccine research.
That's gonna be a post of its own there. That's very, very interesting. That's something I never considered. All right, we've got 15 minutes left. I have a couple tweets, screenshots of a couple tweets that you made that were very interesting. You said, pay attention to your state legislature. What they do frequently has more impact on your life than Congress, and that's the way it should be. Speak to that person who's just sitting on their hands waiting for a better president. How would you build this out for them in a way that's easier to understand?
So if you see on the news some farmers getting arrested and being hauled off to jail, or all his product is being locked up and he can't sell food or even give it to his family, a lot of times that's a state law, not even a federal law. So there are people going to jail for growing food because of state laws. And those are state legislators who are passing those laws. And they're a lot easier to reach than a congressman, right? To reach a U.S. congressman, dude, you have to go to Washington, D.C., and you have to be scheduled to meet with your congressman. It's a lot easier to find a state representative. You know, they may only represent 40,000 people or 100,000 people. Tell them that they need to provide for farm freedom.
All right, so number 2 tweet was, there are 3 places we end up. Number 1, steer our government away from economic collapse. Number 2, economic collapse, and then A, renaissance, B, totalitarianism, or C, national divorce, or the third option being a slow devolution into Chinese-style communism and central control. No one remembers freedom in option number 3. Let's go ahead and talk really quickly about the term national divorce and kind of explain that a little bit further.
Good. All right, well, let me take the top 3 things there first. First of all, correcting the system before there's a collapse seems unlikely to me, given what I've seen in Washington, D.C. So we can scratch number 1 off. Number 3 is the scariest outcome, slow devolution into communist Chinese-style, central planned government, where you have the government always watching, probably with the help of AI, always watching everything you say or do and giving you a social credit score and allowing you to spend your money certain ways or not spend your money. That's actually the path we're on. So I'm scared about that. The one that is sort of in the middle is complete collapse. Okay, that's actually not as scary as devolving into communism. Like, at least in a complete collapse, you got to do something after it collapses, right? There's going to be pain in the collapse. I'm not advocating for collapse, but after it collapses, there can be different outcomes. There can either be, oh, well, here's where we went wrong. We didn't follow the Constitution. Our founding fathers gave us a blueprint and we quit using it. So let's go back to the blueprint. There'll be a bunch of voices who say, well, where we really screwed up is we tried this stupid idea of people electing people and making laws. Like, we need to go back to the bureaucrats running things because they know best what's for us. So there's going to be 2 competing voices. There's the third option, which is national divorce. This great experiment has allowed 50 different states to have a different set of rules, and the rules that work for the city mouse more and more are not working for the country mouse and vice versa. So you may see, it may not be a bad thing. I mean, I'm not talking about a civil war. There may just be an agreement that, hey, we're going to live under a set of rules and you all can live under a different set of rules because we're just not getting along under one size fits all set of rules. So, that would be interesting. I'm not advocating for it. This is where I put my politician hat on. If I say anything more, I will be on the evening news.
Easy out there. From your perspective, have you noticed a difference from administration to administration in your efficacy, in pushing conservative viewpoints?
It really does matter who's in the White House. If I'm a Republican and there's a Democrat in the White House and I write them a letter asking them to do something, I think they heat their buildings with my letters over in the administrative branch. But if there's a Republican in the White House and I'm a Republican in the House, they will answer my phone calls, they will answer my letters, they will try to work with me, even though there's a giant bureaucracy under them that doesn't change when the president changes. They will still try to get me an answer, and that's been helpful. The other thing that happens when a Republican gets elected, as a Republican myself, is they usually appoint people into cabinet positions and into the positions under those cabinet positions. Well, where do they pick those people from? A lot of times they pick them from Congress. You know, when Trump was president, I knew his chief of staff. I knew some of the people over there. So there is a lot of connective tissue between the administrative branch and Congress when they're both the same party. And for me, I sort of long for those days when they'll answer my phone calls.
Right. There's a better network, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah. As a closing, where can people stay current on your efforts, maybe your tweets, or what are they called now? X's?
We call them generically posts now. I still call them tweets. So if you want to interact with me, if you want to comment on my posts and know that I'm reading them, put them on X. The other thing you can do, so my Twitter account is @Rep Thomas Massie, Massie, and the hashtag I like to use is Sassy with Massie. If you can't say something nice, say something vague. So Sassy with Massie is SASSY with MASSIE. And you'll find some of my better material by following that. I love it like when I wake up at 3 a.m. and because I'm like mad at our government, and I wake up at 3 a.m. and I can't go back to sleep, and I'll tweet something, and then somebody will respond and like, why aren't you working right now? And I'm like, dude, chill out. It's 3 a.m. I'm doing this for you for free right now.
All right, so follow him on X. Follow for the best content at #SassyWithMassie. Representative Thomas Massie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.